Welcome to our next edition of Agency Masters. And I think for this one, Kate, I think I must have upset somebody in the marketing team because this one is a bit of a tongue twister. So our webinar today is on proper project planning prevents poor performance, which I've managed to say. So before we jump in, I know there's a lot of people who have registered, and for those who don't know me or haven't joined previous webinars, I'm Steve. I'm one of the co-founders at the Agency Works, and today I am joined once again by our agency veteran and principal consultant, Kate. So thanks for joining, Kate.
Thanks for not adding old to veteran.
Veteran's a better description, I think, just to give a bit of background. But yeah, thanks for joining, Kate. This morning's webinar will last around 20-25 minutes, so hopefully plenty of time to grab a cuppa before your next call. And on today's session, we're going to be delving into the complexities of effective project management within the world of agencies. And whether some of you are seasoned project managers or just starting in the industry, the webinar is designed to equip you with invaluable insights and practical tips to hopefully streamline the project process and enhance team collaboration and ultimately deliver outstanding results to your clients. So I think we've all heard the saying, fail to plan, plan to fail. And we all know that a clear project plan is essential in keeping things organized and on track. So your project will hopefully kick off with clear objectives, an agreed scope, defined timelines, milestones, with all resources and approval plans in place. And that's not to mention elevated comms, collaboration across the team. But we know that things move at a fast pace within agency land, and it's easy to miss out on these key planning stages. We know that work is often chucked into the studio just to get it moving or because of tight deadlines. Now, this can waste a lot of time and effort. So what does proper project planning look like? And to answer those questions and more, I'm going to pass you across to my lovely assistant, Kate, who's going to talk you through that.
Thanks, Steve. And just like to say that that isn't one of our project plans, like pointing fingers and throwing grenades isn't generally. No, yeah. Sometimes that's how it will go, and we'll cover that later. But yeah. So who owns what? I think that's a good place to start. And you know, there is a difference between project management and account management, but they often get mixed up in agencies. Some agencies have account manager, and some have project managers. Some have them both. And it doesn't really matter who is doing this or who's wearing these hats. The important thing is that someone's doing it. So an account manager generally is responsible for understanding what the client needs to achieve, pitching how the agency can use their creativity and their experience to solve challenges, and managing the agency client relationship, which is very important, obviously. And project manager is more responsible for sort of the day-to-day management of a project. And they must be competent in managing 6 aspects of a project, which generally is scope, your schedule, your finances, which are very important, risk, quality, and your resources. So all of those sort of 6 really important things there. But how do we get it right? So this is kind of a good process, a good planning process. So first, we're going to be looking at outlining the purpose and the goals of our project. And this comes before our scoping and planning, and is often called the discovery stage in agencies. Understanding what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to achieve it will help you prevent that dreaded scope creep, which we all definitely don't want. And then onto the scope, you might have initial briefing and brainstorm with the client, and it is the client's job to create the brief, but it isn't just a handover and go away and deliver. As we've said in our previous briefing webinar, as an agency with your experience and expertise, it's your job to help them shape that brief and make it as strong as possible. And we always say we want to be acting as a strategic advisor, not as a supplier. So then sort of after the outline the purpose, goals and scope, we're into the more all-important sort of planning stage that we're talking about today. And next, what you want to try and do is list out your deliverables or outputs that your team will deliver as part of that project. Now, these could be internal, like creating the internal brief, or they could be external, like your client outputs, maybe like delivering your creative concepts. In Synergist, little plug there. This could be, these were generally used, we use our phases for those particular list. And once we've got a clear understanding of each of those phases, you can break them down into tasks or activities needed to deliver them, and to plan who and how much time you'd need for each of those tasks. A top tip here is to remember to estimate time for both internal reviews by client directors and your client teams. Next, you want to think about what's needed to move each task forward. So do they depend on a previous task being done? Maybe some information from a client or maybe a review? And what could stop or risk it moving forward? Hopefully not, but maybe something like the client not liking it. Obviously, that's not going to happen to anybody here on the webinar. And this will help you plan in some sort of buffer time and budget in case things don't go to plan. So defining those dependencies and risks is really important. From here, we're going to create our timeline, working from your start dates and then adding in that list of phases of those tasks and the timings and your resourcing. And this is going to give you a realistic end date. And a few things to remember, remember to add time for those crucial client reviews. And don't retrofit the timings to your deadline. So you need to be realistic. If the client wants it sooner, share that realistic timeline with them. And if they want to reduce the time, then they're going to have to reduce their review time or the deliverables. You know, if you don't do that, you're going to be putting pressure on your team, and that is going to ultimately damage the quality of the work, and eventually that is going to damage your credibility as well. And you also need to check out when the resources are available and book their time out to make sure that you can meet those timelines before you share the timeline with your client for sign off. And then within that same sort of vein, and the final step I'd always recommend is to share that plan with the client, and then for them to share with their stakeholders for sign off, to make sure everybody is sort of on board and aligned with the project. Which leads us to the next point very nicely, managing client expectations, which Steve knows all about.
Hopefully I do, yes. So I think this is a key step, and the key is to managing expectations is literally to kind of tell them what you're going to do, and that often forms part of what is known as scope of work. And the scope of work should include the following elements. So we need to clearly define and articulate the project deliverables in your scope of work. This needs to be kind of specific and measurable terms to ensure that both you and the client have kind of a shared understanding of what constitutes a successful outcome. This should include descriptions of each deliverable, outlining features, specifications, and also any relevant criteria for acceptance. We also need to identify project milestones or checkpoints that match significant stages of completion. So this will help you have a more structured approach and also helps in tracking achievements. But we also need to ensure that milestones coincide with the client reviews, because that will help with feedback and hopefully reduce the likelihood of major revisions later in the project. Agree realistic project timelines, but you also need to factor in the complexity of the task and the potential challenges, and we need to avoid overcommitting. We need to set achievable deadlines. Budget, this is key because this might be different to what you included in your previous proposal. So we need to clearly communicate what's included and, more importantly, what's excluded in the budget. So we need to provide transparency. So when breaking down costs, we need to avoid misunderstandings about the financial scope of the project. And it might also be worth including a contingency in the budget for any unforeseen circumstances. Yeah, this is a common issue. It's important to define the difference between the two, a change and an amendment. We also need to agree on a process of how we handle requests and how they're submitted, perhaps how they're evaluated and how they're approved. And if you're doing that, it's useful to document all changes and amendments, because then this can become a reference point for both you and the client to share. It's also important as well to define roles, and this is both true for internal agency and client side, and these could include project managers, stakeholders, and any other contributors. Yeah, criteria should be measurable and align with the project goals and client expectations, but also you need to involve your client in the process, as this will help promote a shared understanding of the project success. Finally, communication. First, we need to identify relevant stakeholders, internal and external. Then we need to define your preferred communication channel. And finally, we need to agree dates for regular project updates or status reports. Okay. But we know that this always doesn't go to plan, does it, Kate?
No, because otherwise we wouldn't be doing a webinar on it,
Absolutely,
obviously.
yes. We have nothing to talk about.
Where does it all go wrong? Then these are some of the things that I see or did see when working sort of agency side. And the first one there is really important, and we don't allow time to actually plan the project, which in itself takes quite a bit of time. So you're leaving yourself with a big deficit of time there if you don't do that. And the same sort of thing, the next two is sort of you don't allow time for that initial research and discovery as part of that sort of planning, which in turn is not going to give you enough time for that creative thinking stage, which is very important, as most of us are creative agencies. And that the next one there is the client signing off late on the actual proposal is generally quite a big one that can go wrong. Steve, I know that you've probably had a bit of experience in that.
Yeah, it's difficult sometimes just to agree on a deliverable and a timeline based on a verbal we want to proceed, but that can be completely different to when they can actually get the proposal signed off, and that'll have an impact on obviously the proposed timeline. So yeah, that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. And in the same sort of vein, clients not feeding back in the time allocated. So they've asked for 2 days to review, and then they don't feed back for sort of 2 weeks, as one of their key stakeholders wasn't available, because maybe they just didn't book it into their diary or whatever, and that's going to really, mess you up. Or the classic, which I'm sure everyone will relate to on the call, you bust your gut and you send it over to the client, and then you get an out of office saying that they're not about and they're on holiday for 2 weeks. And obviously that's going to sort of break all of your timings, and is always very makes your heart sink a wee bit when you get that out of office. And then the next one, no sort of milestones or sign-off points. So the team sort of carry on delivering, and it's actually gone down it's perhaps gone down the wrong route, and it takes more work to bring it back, because you've gone far too far down the line. And then dependencies not being mapped out. Like you need a resource on a certain day and then it's not there, and it will break all your timings. So that's maybe they're on holiday as well, too much holiday. So you need to make sure you're clear on when you need things to happen to allow other things to happen. And then the big one, the last one, not enough rounds of amends. So typically agencies allow 2 rounds of amends, but the client then needs 5 rounds, and then it's not in budget and it's not in the time plan. So really you're better to be realistic at the start of how many rounds are needed and then plan realistically.
Cool. So Kate's highlighted where things go wrong, but how do we go about getting it right? So here are a few, hopefully, tips for you. The first I'd say is, and we mentioned this previously, getting the scope of work signed off. We need to ensure that the project scope is thoroughly documented and it includes all relevant details. This should be shared with the approved key stakeholders to prevent any misunderstandings later on. And we need to schedule meetings with stakeholders to review the scope document and address any questions or concerns, and make sure that you obtain formal sign-off to confirm their understanding and agreement with the project scope. As Kate said, too many holidays. Who's planning to be away, who's around. If we know this, then it will help with not only internal resource planning, but hopefully it will help prevent delays to the project. But again, we need to develop contingency plans for people unexpectedly being away as well. Once we have this, then we should schedule those client reviews and at any key project milestones to gather feedback and align with client expectations. We should plan these reviews to coincide with completion of those significant deliverables and phases. And as mentioned, we need to consider the availability of stakeholders when scheduling reviews. Yeah, when we talk about estimating and quoting, this is different. To confirm, there is a difference between internal estimates of time and costs compared to what you externally quote the client. So you need to conduct a thorough analysis of your project requirements and potential challenges before providing time and cost estimates. We need to remember to consider kind of factors such as complexity, uncertainty, and any unique aspects of the project. Also need to remember to include contingency time in your estimates to account for unforeseen issues or changes to project scope.
A great webinar on that, I believe.
There is. If you go over to YouTube, you'll be able to find it. And then, yeah, amend and change process. So, wanting a 20-page brochure instead of an 8-page brochure is clearly a change and not an amendment. So we need to define the difference between the two. An amendment may involve minor adjustments, but a change could affect the full project scope, timelines, and budgets. So establishing a well-documented process for both amends and changes, and we need to define how requests will be submitted, evaluated, approved, and also implemented. Yeah, this relates to the phased approvals approach, breaking down the project into clear milestones and obtaining sign-offs at the completion of each phase before you move on to the next. So this will hopefully manage risks and ensure that everybody is aligned throughout the whole project. Sounds simple, but allowing extra time. Agree realistic timelines. We need to set realistic timelines. And again, we take into account the complexity, availability of resources, potential unforeseen challenges, and we need to incorporate contingency time into the project schedule to also include delays or any issues that come up. And the worst thing that could happen is you end up delivering the project early, but that's better than delivering it late. Finally, regular communication. And this can be both with internal teams and with clients, and it could be status meetings, it could be progress reports, but either way, we need to have consistent communication to help everybody stay informed and engaged. You should also encourage open communication. So that's both encouraging team members and clients to share concerns, feedbacks, and updates. That will help you identify potential issues and hopefully will facilitate quick resolution. So that kind of is possible, but you need to be using an effective communication tool. I'm not sure if you know of any effective communication tools. So it could be a good project management system, mentioning no names, or any decent collaboration or messaging platform, but basically anything that will help provide transparency.
Absolutely. So keeping things on track. So along those lines of the communication that you were just talking about, Steve, is a good way to keep things on track would be to have a daily stand-up or huddle, and keep it very short meeting, because we've all got too many meetings in our diaries already. So the way to keep it nice and short would be to ask 3 questions on those huddles, and that would be what you did yesterday, what you're doing today, and what issues may be blocking us going forward. So keep it nice and short. And the next sort of one is your WIP review, so work in progress. So that is a project management term rather than the finance term, which means something very different. Mm-hmm. So this is the checking your work is on track and on brief. So a good example of this for me was many years ago when I worked in the agency world. I'd briefed a dev in, and I'd given them 2 weeks to do some work. I short of sort of seeing him in the kitchen where we had a cup of tea and asking how he was getting on with the getting on with the project. That was all I did. And then the day before, checked in with him, and he'd just gone like a bit mad with it. So he'd let his creativity go wild. It looked fantastic. It was awesome. But it wasn't on brief and it wasn't what the client wanted. And this was all kind of the day before I was due to sort of present it. So it's really, really important that you have those sort of check-ins, because these are creative people and they will go wild if you allow them to. So sometimes they just need reining in a wee bit. So that's kind of just keeping those WIP reviews in your diary. And the next one is sort of your baseline versus your time plan. So you've got your baseline, and it's really important to keep that. You need to change time plan as things get pushed back. But keeping that baseline is important, because if your client has said that they want 2 or 3 days to review, but then it actually took them 2 weeks to feedback because they're on that blooming holiday, then you need to be able to show why the delay happened, and that it was no pointing fingers, but it was actually because you took 2 weeks to sort of feedback. So that's really important to keep that. And then sort of depending on the size of the project, you should probably be looking at daily or weekly updates with your client, letting them know what's been done, what will you be doing next, and if there are any of those issues or risks that could potentially delay the project. So all of those things are kind of really important to keep the project on track.
And what we've tried to do across the full process today of covering the webinar is condense this down to 3 takeaway tips that we would recommend. And I would start with plan to plan. And what I mean by that is allowing yourself enough time to plan the plan. So actually, sometimes we kind of dive into it, but we don't factor in. We need to ensure that that we're kind of liaising with the client and internally, and that's built into our project plan to kind of allow for realistic timelines.
Absolutely. And that second one is, to be realistic, but that's to be realistic about your timeframes. Don't squeeze timings. Make sure you're giving yourself enough buffer for that awesome creativity within your agency, and also to make sure that you put contingency in place for if things do go wrong.
And finally, review, and that is all the way through the process. So whether there's been slippage with your clients, what's happening next, and essentially what you change next time to make things better. So again, those review points are really important. Great. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of today's webinar. I hope you found it useful. If you want any more details or to discuss anything we've covered in more detail, then do reach out at the contact details you can see, or drop us a line via LinkedIn. Our next Agency Masters is on the key to client agency chemistry. So that should be interesting. And we'll ping you details of that later today with a copy of today's recording. As we've mentioned, we do have a YouTube channel which has previous webinars on, alongside with our popular A-game series. So if you have 20 minutes or so free, head across to YouTube to look at that. Or if you want any more insights into agency stuff, then do visit our website as well, The Agency Works. So thanks for joining. Thanks, Kate, for joining again.
Thank you.
And have a great day.
Yeah. Bye.